The smell of apple pie drifted across the table, warm and sweet, cutting through the silence like a strange kind of weapon. Around it sat 4 German prisoners of war, men who had marched under the swastika, who'd been told Americans were savages. Now they stared at a lace tablecloth, porcelain plates, and a woman who smiled as she poured them coffee. Her husband carved the roast. Their children giggled at the strange accents. The soldiers didn't know what to do with their hands. In the camps, food came on tin trays, served by guards with rifles. Here, a child passed them salt. One of them, Obergefreiter Franz Bauer, kept glancing toward the window, half expecting a camera or a trick, some Allied experiment in humiliation. The youngest, barely 20, whispered, "We shouldn't eat. They're testing us." But hunger and confusion won. The first bite of roast melted on his tongue. The girl across the table laughed. "You like it?" she asked. He nodded, though his throat tightened. In that moment, the war he'd carried inside seemed to falter. Across the room, a framed photograph showed the family's son in uniform, a U.S. soldier somewhere in Europe. The Germans lowered their eyes. The father noticed, said nothing, only refilled their cups. Outside, cicadas buzzed, the sound of a country untouched by bombs. Franz didn't understand what he was feeling. Gratitude, shame, disbelief. Only that something inside him cracked. He wrote in his journal that night, "If kindness is their weapon, we never stood a chance." They thought this dinner was an exception, but it wasn't. And what they were about to see next would shake everything they believed about America and about themselves. Before the dinner, before the confusion and the soft laughter of American children, these same men had stood beneath banners that promised eternity. Berlin had fed them stories that America was a mongrel nation, soft and spoiled, collapsing under jazz and democracy. In their barracks, they'd sung of destiny and discipline. They believed victory was ordained, that their enemies were inferior in body and mind. Franz remembered the lectures, maps showing how the Reich would stretch from the Atlantic to the Urals, how the Führer's vision would outlast time itself. They were taught that compassion was weakness, that mercy dulled the blade of conquest. To hesitate was treason. To question was death. When they marched through France, the propaganda followed them. Posters of American soldiers as beasts, faces twisted, clutching whiskey bottles and jazz instruments. They laughed at them. They were the chosen, the pure, the architects of a new world. But by 1944, that world was crumbling. The Allies were everywhere. In the skies, on the beaches, in the fields where they hid and starved. When Franz was captured, he still expected cruelty. He had heard rumors of torture, of firing squads. He braced himself for hatred. Instead, on the deck of a Liberty ship bound west, he saw American sailors joking with one another, black and white together, singing songs he couldn't understand. They weren't angry. They weren't afraid. It was the first fracture in his belief. At night, he leaned on the railing, staring at the endless ocean, not the Rhine, not the North Sea, and wondered if everything he'd been told was a lie. He thought America would be a prison made of iron. But the first thing he saw when the ship reached port was light. They didn't know where they were going, only that the train smelled of hay, tobacco, and something strange, comfort. No armed guards shouting in guttural tones, no dogs barking, just the rhythmic clatter of wheels rolling through a country too wide to understand. Through the wooden slats, Franz watched the landscape unfold like a dream he didn't know existed. Endless fields of corn swayed under the sun, farmhouses painted white, each with its own windmill spinning lazily. Children waved at the train as it passed. Waved, not jeered, not spat, just waved. At first, no one in the car spoke. The silence was heavy, thick with suspicion. One man muttered, "They want to show us what we'll never have." Another whispered, "Maybe it's all fake. Actors, props, a movie." But the scenes kept changing. Towns, factories, people laughing outside diners. No ruins, no fear, no war. At one stop, the doors opened. A young American soldier handed them loaves of bread still warm from a nearby bakery. He even smiled. A real smile, not the kind you fake for propaganda. The Germans stared at him as if he were an apparition. One finally asked, "Where are we?" The soldier shrugged. "Kansas," he said, as if that explained everything. As night fell, the horizon burned orange and the air grew sweet with harvest. Franz leaned his head against the boards, thinking of the Germany he left. Gray skies, ration lines, the sound of boots on cobblestones. Here, even the air felt free. He tried to sleep but couldn't. Every mile pulled him farther from the world he thought he understood. They believed they were being taken to a prison, but what waited at the end of that line looked more like a small town straight out of heaven. The first time Franz saw a Liberty ship being built, he thought it was a lie. No nation could summon that kind of speed. He stood behind a wire fence near the port, watching sparks fall from steel like orange rain. Welders moved in rhythm, men and women side by side, hammering and shouting above the hiss of torches. It looked less like labor and more like music. In Germany, a ship like that would take months, sometimes years. Precise, deliberate, sacred work of a master race. Here, it took 4 days. 4 days to summon an ocean beast of iron and engines. The prisoners whispered among themselves, "Impossible." But there it was, steel plates stacked like cards, cranes dancing, and when the siren blew, an entire vessel slid into the water, christened with a bottle of champagne and applause. Franz's captor, a young naval officer named Miller, saw the disbelief in his eyes. "That's what happens," he said, "when a country fights with factories, not with fear." The words stayed with Franz long after the noise died. He watched the workers during their breaks, women in overalls wiping oil from their cheeks, black men laughing beside white men, sharing cigarettes, arguing about baseball. No ranks, no salutes, no ideology. Just motion, constant, confident motion. For the first time, Franz wondered whether true power wasn't in the uniform or the salute, but in the ordinary rhythm of people free to build. When night fell, the port didn't sleep. Floodlights turned the sky white. Cranes swung like iron giants in the glow. "They build ships faster than we can sink them," a German officer murmured. Franz looked at the water and thought, maybe that's why they'll win. Not because they hate us, but because they don't stop creating. He thought that was the peak of America's strength. But the next thing he saw, a night that refused to end, would shake him even deeper. They arrived in the Midwest just before dusk. Franz thought he'd finally see darkness again. That quiet black sky of wartime Europe, where cities vanished under blackout curtains and the stars trembled above ruins. But when the sun slipped away, the world didn't go dark. It glowed. From the train window, he saw an ocean of light stretching to the horizon. Street lamps, billboards, gas stations, windows shimmering like constellations on Earth. Even the barns had electric bulbs. The air hummed faintly, alive with the pulse of a country that refused to sleep. He pressed his hand to the glass, trying to understand. In Germany, light was rationed, sacred, dangerous. To turn one on at night was to invite bombers. But here, light was a birthright. Children chased fireflies under street lamps. Couples strolled after dinner. Factories burned with energy long after midnight. Inside the carriage, one of the older prisoners whispered, "They waste electricity just to see themselves." Another answered, "Maybe they don't need to hide." The words sank deep. Franz remembered the nights in Hamburg, the sirens, the trembling earth, the smell of dust and flesh. This light felt like defiance, a quiet arrogance that said, "We're not afraid of the dark." At the camp gates, floodlights illuminated neat rows of barracks and a wooden sign, "Camp Concordia." Guards stood relaxed, rifles slung over their shoulders, faces young and untroubled. Behind them, the sky was a pale silver, never quite black. That night, lying on a clean mattress for the first time in years, Franz couldn't sleep. The bulb above his head cast a soft glow through the cracks of the ceiling, steady and calm. As if even the night itself obeyed America. He had survived bombs, hunger, and orders. But this quiet, endless brightness felt more terrifying than war, because it meant the world he'd been told to believe in was already gone. At dawn, they expected barking dogs, shouted orders, maybe even the crack of a rifle butt against ribs. Instead, there was coffee. Real coffee. Not the burnt barley they drank back home. The guards moved without menace, some even whistling as they walked the perimeter. "Welcome to Camp Concordia," one said casually, as if greeting guests, not captives. The Germans didn't understand. There were no fences crowned with barbed wire, no towers every 100 meters. Only a wide stretch of prairie, open and golden. A man could walk for miles, yet none ever tried. Maybe because escape made no sense. Where would you go in a land so vast, so calm, it felt like God had already claimed it? Franz studied the daily routine. 3 meals, clean clothes, even Sunday services. They could play soccer, paint, write letters. Some were assigned to farms, earning a few cents a day. When they laughed, genuinely laughed, it frightened them. "If they treat enemies like this," one whispered, "how strong must they be with their own?" One morning, Franz saw something that broke him more than any interrogation could. A guard was reading Faust in German, mouthing each word carefully. When he noticed Franz watching, he smiled and said, "Trying to learn your language." That single moment, a guard learning the prisoner's tongue, made the whole idea of the master race collapse like glass. The commandant's rule was simple. Respect earns respect. No slogans, no ideology. It was the first time Franz encountered authority that didn't need to shout to be obeyed. At night, as crickets sang outside, he wrote in his journal, "We built fences in our minds long before they built them around us. They thought kindness was a trick." But what came next, a meal that tasted like home, would make even that belief crumble. It happened on a Sunday, the kind of day that in Germany had once meant church bells and ration lines. Here it meant laughter drifting from kitchens and the smell of something sweet in the air. The guards called it a treat. The prisoners thought it was mockery. Franz stood in line, tin plate in hand, expecting soup or bread. Instead, a smiling cook dropped a round, glistening sandwich onto his plate. A hamburger still steaming, the scent of grilled meat and onions filling the mess hall. Then came bottles of something dark and fizzy. Coca-Cola. The label alone felt like an artifact from another world. He hesitated. Back home, they'd been told America was decadent, drowning in sugar and greed. But the first bite told a different story. The bread was soft, the meat rich and smoky. The Coke stung his tongue with cold sweetness, unnecessary, excessive, joyful. For the first time since capture, the men laughed. Real laughter, unguarded. A sergeant walked past their table, smirking. "Not bad, huh?" Franz could only nod. Across from him, another prisoner murmured, "We've been fighting a country that tastes like happiness." The words hung there, absurd and heavy. Later, as they sat outside under the open sky, someone played a radio. Swing music, bright and alive. An American girl's voice sang about summer love, and the prisoners fell silent. That sound, that ease, was what their empire had tried to crush. That night, Franz couldn't eat his rations without remembering the taste of that burger. It wasn't food. It was proof that a nation at war could still feed joy to its enemies. He began to suspect that America's real strength wasn't its bombs or ships, but its confidence that kindness would win anyway. And yet, The letters those men wrote after that meal would shake families all the way across the Atlantic. When the censors opened the mailbags that week, they didn't expect trouble. Just the usual homesick notes about weather, boredom, and missing cigarettes. But the letters from Camp Concordia were different. They pulsed with something dangerous: disbelief. Franz's letter began innocently enough. "Mother, I am well. The Americans treat us fairly." Then he hesitated, pen hovering above the page. "How do you explain that your captors feed you meat every day, that you sleep on clean sheets, that you drink coffee sweeter than anything in Berlin? How do you write that you laughed with a man wearing the enemy's uniform?" Others wrote the same. "We are healthy. The guards are kind. We are paid for our work." One even dared to say, "They have no fear of hunger here. The land itself seems to give." Some letters never reached home. The Nazi postal monitors in Europe confiscated hundreds. Those that slipped through caused ripples, small at first, then widening. Families whispered, could it be true? Mothers of fallen sons cried, not from comfort, but confusion. Everything propaganda had built, the myth of the brutal American, began to erode under the quiet honesty of their own boys. In Hamburg, a woman named Greta Bauer read her son's letter aloud in secret. Her neighbors listened in silence. "He says they gave him ice cream," one whispered. "Ice cream?" another echoed. "During war?" It was unthinkable, but the ink didn't lie. Back in Kansas, Franz sealed his second letter with trembling hands. He wrote, "They do not hate us. That frightens me more than hate." For the first time, the battlefront shifted, not on land or sea, but in hearts and minds. And while those words crossed oceans, the prisoner's next assignment would take them even closer to America's soul, its farms, its families, and its quiet power to disarm without a single bullet. The first time Franz was taken out of camp to work, he thought it was a trick, a test of loyalty, maybe a trap. The truck rolled through endless golden fields, and the air smelled of earth, wheat, and gasoline. At the edge of a vast Kansas farm, the guards stopped and waved them out. "You'll help harvest today," one said. No rifles raised, no barking orders, just trust. The sun was already high when they began. The farmers, ordinary Americans in denim and sweat-stained hats, worked beside them, not above them. Women drove tractors. A young black foreman named Henry handed out tools, joking, "Don't break my shovel, soldier boy." The men froze, unsure if they were allowed to laugh. Then he laughed first, and something inside them loosened. Franz had never seen such rhythm in labor. No overseers, no slogans about sacrifice. Just people moving together, driven by pride, not fear. When noon came, they ate under the shade of a barn. Sandwiches wrapped in paper, lemonade in glass jars. The farmer's wife passed them cookies. "Eat," she said simply. Franz looked at his hands, blistered, rough, and realized he was working not for an empire, not under compulsion, but for the first time, for life itself. As they loaded the last crates, he noticed Henry and an older farmer arguing, loud, animated, laughing again seconds later. In Germany, disagreement meant weakness. Here, it was oxygen. That night, back at camp, the men couldn't stop talking. "They argue with their bosses," one said. "They let women command. They joke with colored men." Every rule they'd been taught about hierarchy and order was unraveling. Franz wrote in his journal, "They build without fear. Maybe that's why everything grows here, even hope." But he hadn't seen the strangest thing yet. How Americans could turn even the middle of a desert into a place that tasted like joy. By midsummer, Franz had been moved again, this time to Arizona. The heat was merciless, the kind that made metal burn to the touch. Sand stretched in every direction, and the horizon shimmered like molten glass. Even the wind felt tired. The prisoners were building irrigation channels under a sky that never blinked. Their shirts clung to their backs, salt crusting on their skin. Around noon, when the air seemed to stop moving, they heard an engine, a distant hum growing louder until a military truck rumbled into view, kicking up dust. The men expected water, maybe rations. Instead, when the truck stopped, a group of American soldiers jumped down carrying metal tubs packed with ice. Inside, barrels of vanilla ice cream. Franz thought it was a hallucination, the desert playing tricks on his mind. But then the guards began scooping, handing cones to each prisoner as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. One of them grinned, saying, "Can't let you melt out here." The cold hit his tongue like a miracle. Sweet, clean, absurd. The men laughed, the sound echoing off the dry hills. For a few minutes, the desert wasn't punishment. It was paradise. He stared at the Americans who made this happen, sweating, dusty, laughing too. They didn't do it for propaganda. They didn't even seem to notice how strange it was. For them, joy was a right, not a luxury. That night, Franz wrote in his journal, "Even in the desert, they make happiness cold." It was the first time he realized the war wasn't just about weapons. It was about imagination. The Germans had built fear into every corner of their lives. The Americans built comfort, even in hell. He didn't know it yet, but that quiet generosity would soon reach far beyond food. It would reach into the very walls of the camp and into his soul. It began with small gestures, almost invisible, yet they pierced deeper than any weapon. A guard who lent his lighter to a prisoner. A cook who saved an extra slice of pie. A chaplain who stopped by the barracks, not to preach, but to ask if anyone needed paper to write home. It was all so quiet, so unforced, that it unsettled them more than the sound of guns ever had. Franz watched one guard in particular, Sergeant Miller, a man who always carried himself with an easy calm. No shouting, no insults. He called prisoners men, not krauts. Once, when Franz accidentally spilled a bucket of paint, Miller knelt down beside him to help clean it. No scolding, no punishment, just a shrug and a simple, "Happens to all of us." That moment broke something open inside Franz. He'd spent years being told compassion was weakness, that mercy was for fools. Yet here was a man who commanded respect without raising his voice, who seemed stronger precisely because he didn't need to prove it. In the evenings, when the prairie wind cooled the air, the prisoners would sit outside their barracks, watching the guards play baseball. The game was simple, almost childish, but there was beauty in it. Order without fear, rules without cruelty. And when a guard hit a home run, everyone, even the prisoners, couldn't help but cheer. One night, Miller handed Franz a copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. "You might like it," he said. "It's about freedom." Franz took it, unsure whether to laugh or cry. He wrote in his diary, "They conquer without killing. They rule without orders. They make goodness look effortless." The war had taught him to hate, but in this strange, quiet corner of Kansas, he was learning how to feel human again, and soon that humanity would cross a forbidden line, when friendship slipped through the barbed wire, and the enemy became something far more dangerous, a friend. It started with a wave, just that, a simple fleeting wave from a boy on a bicycle as the prisoners marched past on their way to the fields. Franz pretended not to see it, but he felt something tighten in his chest. The next morning, the boy was there again, this time holding an apple. He tossed it through the fence. Franz caught it. No one said a word. By summer's end, such small rebellions of kindness became routine. A farmer's wife slipped extra bread into their lunch pails. Children left wildflowers near the gates. Some prisoners, the ones who spoke a bit of English, began to exchange greetings with locals. "Good morning. How are you? Hot today." The guards saw it, but often turned away. Maybe they understood that this kind of contact did more for peace than punishment ever could. One Sunday, a local pastor asked if a few of the German men could help repaint his church. Permission was granted. Franz went with them. Inside the chapel, the smell of fresh paint mixed with hymns from a radio. The pastor's wife brought lemonade. At noon, they all ate together. No uniforms, no weapons, just people sharing food under a cross that didn't care which language prayers were spoken in. Later that week, a family invited Franz to dinner. He almost refused, fearing some rule would be broken. But curiosity, and something softer, won. That evening, he found himself sitting at a wooden table, the same as the one from his dreams. Candles, bread, roast chicken, laughter. The father asked about his hometown. The mother pressed a slice of pie into his hand, for later. Walking back under the starlight, Franz realized something terrifying. He no longer felt like a prisoner. He felt forgiven. That night he wrote, "We are still behind fences, but I no longer know who is free, them or us." Yet even in this fragile peace, there were things they were never meant to see. Truths America kept hidden behind its own fences, waiting for the day the war would end. For all their freedom, the clean beds, the work, the laughter, there were still invisible borders the prisoners could not cross. Behind the fences lay an America they weren't meant to witness. Franz first sensed it when their truck passed through a small town one afternoon. The streets bustled with families, diners, and movie posters for Casablanca. But on the edge of town, he saw something different. Rows of wooden shacks, laundry flapping in the wind, and faces, dark faces, watching silently as the convoy rolled by. The guards didn't explain. They just told the men to look straight ahead. Later, while working near the rail yard, Franz overheard two guards talking about relocation camps out west. One of them lowered his voice. "Japanese Americans," he said. "Whole families behind wire, same as these Germans." Franz froze. He couldn't understand. The same country that handed him ice cream had caged its own people? That night, he looked at the lighted horizon and felt something twist inside him. Maybe every nation had its shadow, even one that glowed so brightly. Back in the barracks, another prisoner showed him a newspaper clipping about a race riot in Detroit. Franz traced the photo of smoke and rubble with his finger. He'd thought America was perfect. Now he saw it was simply human. And maybe that was worse, or better. He couldn't decide. When he asked Sergeant Miller about it, the man sighed. "We don't always live up to what we believe, but at least here, we're allowed to try." Franz said nothing. He just nodded, because for the first time, he realized that America's greatest weapon wasn't its perfection. It was its ability to admit imperfection and keep moving forward. He thought he had seen everything worth knowing about this country. But soon, in a single whispered conversation about a weapon beyond imagination, he would understand how America truly won the war, not with kindness, but with science that bent the sky itself. It happened during a repair shift at the edge of the camp. Nothing unusual at first. The Americans were fixing a broken truck near the fence, the air thick with dust and engine oil. Franz was stacking lumber when he overheard two young U.S. officers talking by the hood. "That new fuse," one said, wiping sweat from his neck. "It detonates itself mid-air, senses the target." The other laughed. "Yeah, proximity fuse. Doesn't even need a direct hit anymore. The shell knows when it's close." Franz froze. The word sounded absurd. The shell knows? In his mind, artillery was crude, brutal, unpredictable. Yet these Americans spoke of science as if it were sorcery. He edged closer, pretending to adjust his tools, listening to phrases he barely understood. Micro-radar, vacuum tube, precision timing. They spoke casually, like men discussing baseball scores. That night, he told the others. The barracks fell silent. One man scoffed, "Impossible." Another muttered, "Propaganda." But a former engineer whispered, "No, I've heard of it. We couldn't make it work." Franz lay awake long after lights out, the ceiling glowing faintly. He imagined shells hovering over his homeland, sensing, thinking, striking, before soldiers even ducked. For the first time he felt not anger but awe, and something colder. Surrender. Days later during lunch, he saw an American newspaper headline left on a bench. "New fuse turns tide at Battle of the Bulge." There was a photograph. Smoke, shattered trees, soldiers looking skyward in disbelief. He folded the page, hiding it under his jacket like forbidden scripture. When Sergeant Miller caught him reading it later, he didn't scold. He just said quietly, "We build to protect, Franz. You built to dominate. That's the difference." Franz couldn't answer. His empire, his certainty, his faith in German genius, all of it collapsed into silence. He thought technology was the end of the story. But what came next would reach beyond science, into the heart of every man who'd ever believed in a flag. The news arrived not with explosions, but with paper. A single sheet passed from hand to trembling hand in the barracks. A newspaper clipping someone had smuggled in from the outside world. It bore one word that silenced the entire camp: Auschwitz. At first, no one spoke. They read the lines again and again. Gas chambers, furnaces, children's shoes piled by the thousands. The words blurred in the flickering light. Someone muttered, "Lies. American lies." But his voice cracked halfway through. Franz felt the world tilt. He remembered the songs, the parades, the speeches about purity and destiny. He remembered the medals pinned on chests that no longer seemed brave. He thought of the kindness he'd been shown here, coffee poured by smiling guards, laughter over baseball, and tried to reconcile it with the images in that article. He couldn't. That night, a man named Otto, once an SS corporal, stood in the doorway, shaking. "We said we were saving Germany," he whispered. "We were burning it." He tore the article into pieces, but it didn't matter. The truth had already lodged itself inside them like shrapnel. In the following days, the camp grew quieter. The boasting stopped. The jokes dried up. Even the guards seemed to sense the change. No one saluted anymore. Some prisoners began asking for English dictionaries. Others requested American newspapers. A few started sketching, painting scenes not of glory, but of forgiveness, portraits of people they'd wronged, faces they'd forgotten. Franz spent hours staring at the horizon where the prairie met the sky. The wind moved gently through the grass. No bombs, no orders, no voices telling him what to believe. Just silence. And in that silence, his faith in the Reich, in obedience, in hate, finally died. He wrote his last entry for that month. "They defeated us long before the surrender, the moment we saw what humanity truly looks like." But the war wasn't over yet, not inside him, because what awaited him next would not be defeat, but a fragile, aching rebirth. It was Christmas Eve, 1944. The wind carried the scent of pine and cold metal across the Kansas plains. The guards had strung a few strands of tinsel in the mess hall, hung paper stars above the tables, a small act of mercy in a season that belonged to peace, not war. After dinner, someone in the American barracks began to play a harmonica. The tune floated over the fence, faint, uncertain. Silent night. For a moment, no one in the German camp moved. Then an older prisoner, Karl, closed his eyes and began to sing softly in German. Stille, Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Others joined, one voice after another, until the air itself seemed to tremble. Across the wire, the harmonica paused, then picked up the melody again, this time slower, warmer. Guards leaned against posts, listening. One of them, Miller, quietly took off his cap. Soon the two languages blended. English and German weaving together over the winter night. All is calm, all is bright. The words no longer belong to one side or the other. For that brief moment, there were no uniforms, no ranks, no past, only men, cold, homesick, alive. Franz felt his throat tighten. He thought of his mother lighting candles in Hamburg, wondering if he was still breathing somewhere. He thought of every man here, sons, brothers, fathers, all trapped by ideas too heavy for human hearts. When the last note faded, the camp was silent except for the wind brushing the wire. No one dared to speak. A few prisoners raised their hands in quiet salute. The guards nodded back. Then, as if nothing had happened, everyone slowly returned to their bunks. But sleep didn't come easily. Franz wrote one line in his diary that night. If a song can cross a fence, maybe forgiveness can too. By morning, the frost had turned the ground to glass. The world looked new, untouched. But they knew the war still raged an ocean away. Soon, word would come that everything they'd once fought for had collapsed. And for many of them, peace would feel heavier than war ever did. The news arrived on a cloudless morning. The guards didn't shout, didn't celebrate. They simply posted a bulletin outside the mess hall. Germany surrenders. War over. The words looked ordinary on the paper, small, almost merciful. But when the prisoners read them, it was as if the ground itself gave way. Some stared blankly. Others laughed, a strange, hollow laughter that carried more pain than joy. A few men dropped to their knees and prayed, not for victory, but for forgiveness. Franz just stood there, unable to breathe. He'd imagined this moment so many times. The triumph, the parades, the new world they were promised. But now the Reich had vanished like smoke. That night, Camp Concordia was silent. No songs, no card games, no laughter. The men sat in the dim light of their barracks, trying to understand who they were without the cause that had defined them. One of the younger soldiers whispered, "If we are no longer soldiers, what are we?" No one answered. Franz wandered outside. The prairie stretched endlessly under a silver moon. He could see the faint outline of the American flag waving on the guard post. Calm, steady, indifferent. A strange peace filled him, mixed with a grief too deep to name. Sergeant Miller approached, hands in his pockets. "You heard the news," he said softly. Franz nodded. "It's over," Miller added. Franz looked up. "No," he said after a long pause. "It's just beginning." Miller didn't ask what he meant. He simply offered him a cigarette. They stood in silence, two men from opposite worlds, united by exhaustion. The smoke drifted into the night, like ghosts leaving the body of war. In his journal, Franz wrote, "Defeat is not when your army falls. It's when you realize you were fighting the wrong enemy all along, and that enemy was inside you." The next morning, orders came. They would be sent home soon, but no one cheered. Home was no longer a place, it was a question. And when they finally saw what waited for them beyond the Atlantic, they would understand that surrender was only the beginning of another kind of captivity. The ship that carried them back to Europe felt nothing like the one that had brought them to America. No singing this time, no banter on deck. Just silence and the slow groan of steel cutting through a gray Atlantic. The men leaned over the railing, staring into the fog, each haunted by a question they were afraid to ask. What's left to go home to? When the harbor finally appeared, Franz barely recognized it. The cranes were twisted skeletons. The skyline of Hamburg, once proud, alive, looked like a mouth missing all its teeth. Smoke still curled from blackened chimneys. There were no flags, no soldiers, only civilians moving like shadows through ruins. At the port, no one greeted them as heroes. No one greeted them at all. A woman shuffled past in rags, clutching a loaf of stale bread. Children dug through rubble for scrap metal. A man with one arm sat by the road, staring at nothing. Franz realized this was what fatherland had become. Hunger, dust, and ghosts. He tried to find his home. It was gone. Just a crater filled with rainwater. His mother's house, his old street, even the corner bakery, all vanished. The city smelled of wet ash and despair. That night, he slept in what was left of a doorway, listening to the wind whistle through the ruins. In the morning, he met another former prisoner, Otto, sitting on the curb with a tin cup. They didn't speak for a long time. Finally, Otto said, "We came back free, but there's nothing left to belong to." Franz nodded. He thought of the guards in Kansas, of the families who had fed him, of the laughter of children under a sky full of light. And he realized something devastating, that he had felt more human in the enemy's camp than in his own homeland. He wrote in his journal, "We left cages of wire, only to walk into cages of rubble." But amid the ashes, something fragile began to stir. A memory, a voice, a promise, a piece of paper that would soon travel back across the ocean, carrying words he never expected to write. Weeks passed before Franz could find paper and ink, luxuries in a land now stripped bare. He sat by a broken window one evening, using the light of a single candle to write. The city outside was silent except for the distant hammering of men trying to rebuild walls that no longer remembered their shape. He began slowly, unsure where to start. "Dear Mrs. Henderson, you may not remember me. I was one of the men your family invited to Sunday dinner in Kansas. I remember the pie, apple, I think, and your little girl asking if I liked America. I didn't know how to answer then. Now I do. You showed me a world that did not need enemies." He hesitated, then continued. "I came home to find nothing left, but when I close my eyes, I still see your table, your kindness. You fed not my stomach, but my soul. I hope your son came home safe." He signed it, Franz Bauer, former prisoner, number 2136. He wasn't the only one. Dozens of former POWs across Germany wrote similar letters, to Kansas, to Texas, to Iowa, small attempts to reach across the distance between ruin and grace. They thanked farmers for smiles, guards for fairness, strangers for lemonade in the heat. The local postmasters, overwhelmed and suspicious, marked many of them, returned to sender underuritis, undeliverable. Some never left the country at all. Others vanished in transit, buried under piles of official correspondence about reconstruction and reparations. Franz's letter never came back, never arrived, somewhere between two worlds, one of rubble, one of light. It simply disappeared. But he kept writing it again and again, copying it into his journal, afraid the memory might fade before he could say it properly. He wrote, "They taught me that mercy survives even when nations die." Years later, when a new Germany began to rise from the ruins, that memory and that letter would pull him across the ocean once more, back to the land that had changed him. Because some debts are not paid with money. They are paid by coming home, to the heart. It was 1955 when Franz set foot on American soil again, 10 years older, carrying a single suitcase and a silence that no border agent could question. The ship docked in New York, and as he stepped down the gangway, the smell of salt and gasoline folded into something else. Memory. America hadn't changed much. The streets still hummed with motion, with confidence. But Franz had. He took a train west. Kansas looked just as it had in his dreams. Open skies, golden fields, wind that smelled like home, even though it wasn't. At the small-town station, a boy helped him with his bag. "You here for business?" the boy asked. Franz smiled. Something like that. He walked the dusty road to a white farmhouse that looked both familiar and impossibly distant. The porch creaked. The door opened. There she was. Mrs. Henderson, hair silver now, eyes the same gentle blue. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she said softly, You came back. Franz tried to answer, but his throat closed. She led him inside to the same wooden table, the same lace cloth, the same smell of coffee. On the wall hung a faded photograph. Her son in uniform, smiling. Franz lowered his eyes. He didn't come home, she said quietly. But you did. Sit. They ate in silence just as before. Roast chicken, apple pie, the clock ticking steady as memory. Outside, cicadas sang the same song they'd sung a decade earlier. When she poured him coffee, his hands trembled. I never forgot, he whispered. She smiled a little sadly. We just did what was right. Franz looked around that warm, sunlit kitchen, the place where his hatred had died. He realized this wasn't just a return, it was redemption. Before leaving, he placed a small envelope on the table, the letter he had written years ago but never mailed. She didn't open it. She only placed her hand over his and said, Some things don't need words. Outside, the wind moved through the wheat like an old hymn. Franz turned back once, seeing her silhouette in the doorway. The same kindness that had once disarmed a soldier. He had come as an enemy. He left as a son of mercy. That night, Franz stayed at a small inn on the edge of town. The window overlooked the wheat fields, pale gold beneath a full moon. He couldn't sleep. The ticking of the wall clock reminded him of another night, the one long ago, when he'd sat at that same table, too ashamed to lift his eyes as an American family passed him bread. He reached into his coat and unfolded a piece of paper. Yellowed, creased, the words fading, but still legible. You fed not my stomach, but my soul. The letter had finally found its home. He thought about all he had seen since then, the ruins of Hamburg, the empty stares of men who never escaped their uniforms, the rebuilding of a nation that still whispered in guilt. Yet here, across an ocean, everything that had been broken seemed, for a moment, quietly whole. At dawn, Franz walked out to the field behind the inn. The horizon glowed pink, the same color as the Kansas mornings of his captivity. He closed his eyes and let the wind brush his face. The war had ended 10 years ago, but only now did peace arrive, not as a treaty, but as forgiveness. He realized America's true victory wasn't written in treaties or carved on memorials. It was written in gestures. A cup of coffee, a song across the fence, a slice of pie offered to a stranger who no longer believed in humanity. When the train came to take him east, Franz left a note with the innkeeper. It read simply, They taught me that freedom is not the absence of walls, it's the presence of kindness. As the train pulled away, he looked once more at the town fading into light. He imagined the Henderson farmhouse waking to another Sunday morning, the smell of roast and coffee drifting through open windows. Somewhere a harmonica might still play Silent Night. He smiled, a quiet, unremarkable smile, the kind that belongs to a man who has finally made peace with the ghosts inside him. No medals, no flags, no speeches, just the sound of a train crossing the plains, carrying one man who had once been the enemy and now, at last, understood what victory really meant. I came as an enemy. His final journal entry read, I left as a human,